session. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I should have said it first, maybe. Okay, well, this is actually the third year that ISOCARP is organizing planning, education, and practice sessions. The first one was organized in Doha by our colleague Piotr Lorenz in cooperation with ISOP and GPEAN again. And last year we had two sessions, one online and one in person in the Brussels Congress. So here we are in Toronto Congress in the 59th ISOCARP Congress, having a planning education session, both online and in person. So actually, this is a very important, I think, event in terms of integrating education and practice, theory and practice. So it has a very important mission. And I hope this tradition will go on further. Let me introduce myself very briefly, just in case if you don't know me. I'm Zeynep Enlil, as you know. I am a professor of urban planning teaching at Yildiz Technical University in Istanbul, Turkey. And I'm an ancient ISOCARPian from a long time ago. And I served in the society in various capacities. And last year, I was the general rapporteur of the last year's Congress. And of course, I have different hats. Besides being a professor of urban planning and a old member of ISOCARP, I am also representing Turkish schools of planning in GPEAN. And currently, I'm chairing GPEAN. GPEAN is an association of 11 associations, so it has a very global representation. So this session will bring in three prominent speakers from three of our associations under the umbrella of GPEAN. We will have ANZAPS represented by Anna Hurlimann, Australian and New Zealand associations of planning schools. And we have Cassidy Johnson representing ISOP, Association of European Schools of Planning. And we have our colleague Mark Seasons from University of Waterloo representing the study that has jointly been done by ACUP, which is Association of Canadian University Planning Programs, and ACSP, American Collegiate Schools of Planning. So it is it's going to be a rather comprehensive view, I guess, from global north. Unfortunately, we are missing global south, but we are hoping that this will be one in a series that would later on include global south. And then, of course, we're hoping that in the discussions, we will be able to integrate views from or needs from those parts of the world as well. Our speakers will be sharing with us their recent research, which is, I think, has been triggered by the initiative of planning for planners for climate action, and it is a good moment to address how planning education is responding to climate issues. So in this special session, we aim to discuss how planning education and practice actually are responding to climate crisis. What sort of competencies do the professional planners in practice need in order to deal with climate change? And does our universities, our planning education really provide the competencies that they need in their practice? So then we will look at what is provided in the planning curricula, what competencies do they provide in the planning departments, and is it enough? Are we preparing our students, prospective planners, with sufficient skills? What is lacking and what needs to be improved in order to deal with climate change and to improve climate education at our universities? So these are the questions that we will try to have an insight from these researches. And then we are hoping that we will have the insight into how planning education, how planning curricula can adapt to achieve climate justice as well in this endeavor. So we will have these examples from, as I said, Australia, Europe, and North America. And now I will give the floor to our first speaker, Anna Hurlimann from Australia. And again, special thanks to her. I mean, special thanks to all our speakers, but she is in a very different time zone, and it's almost past 1:30 a.m. in the morning. And she said that she wouldn't mind to drink a little bit more coffee to stay awake and contribute to our session. So please, Anna, take the floor. Would you introduce yourself, or should I do that?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to do that. Thanks very much, Zeynep, for the invitation to participate in this session. So my name is Anna Hurlimann. I'm an associate professor of urban planning at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and my teaching and research focuses on climate change and environmental planning. And some of the work I've been doing recently has been focused in particular on the education of urban planners for climate change. And in addition to the research I'm going to talk about today, I'm also doing a project that's developing a framework for the incorporation of climate change into curriculum, like curriculum updates. And we're then trialling that on the Master of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne. So there might be some insights on that we can share that we hope can be used by other programs, even in our faculty, such as the architecture program. But I'll get started now, and I'll put a timer on to make sure I don't go too much over time. So I want to firstly acknowledge that today I am making this presentation on Indigenous country, and I make my presentation here in the Kabi land in northeastern Australia, and most of the research was conducted while I'm living on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I'll quickly talk a bit about Australia and climate change in that context, and mention the impetus for greater climate change action by urban planners, and particularly in education, and then introduce our project and method before discussing the results. And I want to acknowledge a few of my colleagues here, particularly Patrick Cobiner and Judy Bush, who were co-chief investigators with me on this research project, and also some research assistants we had, including Laura Brown and Eric Garcia. So Australia is quite a large country, but we only have 24 million people. And on the right-hand side, in yellow, you can see our population distribution. So you can see it's mainly in coastal areas and mainly on the east coast of Australia. And this really does contribute to our high greenhouse gas emissions because of this sparse population distribution. And also I've heard recently that many European airlines are choosing not to fly as much to Australia in order to reduce their emissions, which is going to make us even more isolated from other parts of the world, perhaps. But yeah, there are distinct urban climate change issues for us as a nation. So we're facing significant climate change issues, and here's a snapshot of them there in that picture. Particularly in the context of having sustained population growth, with migration playing a key role, significant urban expansion and expanding in a sprawling way, and environmental impacts of this growth. We've also got a resource-dependent economy. We export a lot of coal and other resources, which it really factors into our whole economy. And we're going to face significant climate change impacts. And in fact, many reports say that we're one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, and it's going to cost us a lot of money. So these are really key issues that we need to face as a society. I wanted to just show this graph. It's one of the key ones I think is really important to show that globally, in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement, we need to get our emissions bending down to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees to meet that limit of warming. Yet our trajectory of emissions given current policy scenarios is up here. So we need significant change, particularly in Australia, where we have these sprawled cities, where we know that our cities make a significant contribution to climate change, and they're going to hold the key to trying to get our emissions as a country down in the range of, zero net emissions by 2050 and sooner. So as was mentioned in a previous session, there have been increasing calls to build the climate change competencies of built environment professionals. This is coming through the latest IPCC assessment report, and also from the report that was done in 2020 by the various Commonwealth associations of built environment groups, and also impetus from, as Zeynep mentioned, Planners for Climate Action of UN Habitat, which had a draft report which aimed to assess the state of the profession of urban planning in various countries and multiple locations internationally. And that's where a few of these projects started. Yet we also know that the background research that had been done showed that climate change had received limited attention in the formal education of urban planners. So there was a real need for us within the context of urban planning to understand that. So my colleagues and I decided that we would apply for a seed grant from the University of Melbourne to understand climate change education of urban planners in Australia. And we had two phases to this project. The first phase was to understand how well climate change education is integrated into Australian urban planning courses. And then the second phase was to understand how well prepared Australian urban planners are to implement urban planning actions to address climate change. So I'll now present results of phase one. So what we did is a content analysis of the Planning Institute of Australia's accreditation document. So the Planning Institute of Australia accredits degrees in Australia so that the students that graduate can become members of the Institute. And then we also did a content analysis of 20% of the Planning Institute's accredited urban planning degrees. So this sample was diverse. We had rural and urban locations for the degree and various different types of degree. And we reviewed the degree content, the course overview and the core subjects, the overview and the objectives. So we realised there are some limitations to this, but also we were constrained in terms of time and resources. So this just shows the 9 degrees that we content analysed and the different sort of characteristics. Some were graduate level courses, others undergraduate. Some were part of the group of 8 universities in Australia and others weren't. And they also had different sort of composition of a different number of subjects and different faculty bases. So we looked into a number of different issues. So we looked at core sort of explicit climate change issue coverage in the subjects, in the core subjects. We also looked at coverage of sustainable urban form issues and then implicit climate change issues. So we looked at Sharon's 4 key components of education for sustainability. So we looked at things that the concepts of liberal education, interdisciplinarity, cosmopolitanism and civics. And this just shows the results for the 9 degrees, how many of them covered each of these specific climate change issues, and then also whether or not the PIA, Planning Institute of Australia accreditation document covered each of this issue. So we can see that general mention of climate change, 4 of the 9 degrees did mention climate change in general in at least one of their core subjects. But there are a lot of other climate change issues that didn't get mentioned at all in some degrees or very few, and not the accreditation document either. When we look to sustainable urban form, also there was not much coverage. Sustain, in terms of the STEM word for sustainability, was most covered. And again, not all were covered in the Planning Institute accreditation document. However, we did find that those Sharon's issues were covered more. This, for example, is cosmopolitanism, the theme. So diversity and inclusion, equity, global considerations, and also thinking about future sort of temporal scales was covered quite well in most of the degrees. So in terms of the findings of the analysis of those degrees and the content covered, in a snapshot, we found that there was limited coverage of explicit climate change issues and limited coverage of sustainable urban form issues. However, coverage of education for sustainability themes was a bit stronger. And those general sustainability themes from Sharon. So this indicates, I guess, the benefit of revising the accreditation document from PIA that's sort of leading the content of these courses, their coverage, and of reviewing the content of urban planning degrees as well, and sort of updating the curriculum. But I think we think those skills covered by Sharon's sort of liberal education, a whole plan is in good stead for implementing much change that's needed in terms of climate change, and much of the discussion that was held last session in terms of justice as well. So not all is lost, but we do have some more work to do to upgrade the curriculum. Our results are published in Environmental Education Research if you're interested in more of the detailed and nuance of the findings. So in terms of phase 2, we've just had the results of this survey published in the American Journal of Planning, Education and Research. And so we explored how well prepared Australian urban planners felt they were to implement planning actions to address climate change. It was an online survey, unfortunately, of only 154 Australian urban planning practitioners. That was held during COVID in 2020. And so, yeah, there's just the details of the paper. It's available in open access. So the 2 questions guiding this research were, do Australian urban planners perceive they have climate change knowledge, skills and competence? And then also, how are Australian urban planners addressing climate change in their practice? So the work that was influential to how we designed the survey was thinking about the Bologna Accord and the Dublin descriptors. So this is one of the key sort of foundations for education in Europe. And so that has the idea of, that qualifications will have some kind of standard of addressing knowledge and understanding, applying knowledge and understanding, making judgments, having communication skills, and having lifelong learning skills as well. So we applied this to think to urban planning and think of what a planner would need, because a lot of research shows that we don't, just knowing about climate change is not going to be enough. We need to also know, planners also need skills and competence to implement that knowledge in their practice, as well as other sort of practitioners as well in other fields. So it's not just about knowledge. And the Canadian Institute of Planners has done multiple surveys over a long period of time, and the most recent one was in 2019 about surveying Canadian Institute of Planners about their climate change knowledge. So many of the questions we used so that we could then compare them to the results that we found in Australia. So some of the results that I present, I'll compare the Canadian results with Australian results too. So in terms of knowledge, skills and competence, we found that in terms of the statements we developed at 2 levels, undergraduate and postgrad. So Bologna first cycle is the undergrad and the second cycle is postgrad. We found that for knowledge and understanding, overall there was a high level of stated knowledge and awareness of climate change, yet much lower sort of rating that the individuals that did our survey had the ability to apply that knowledge and make judgments and communicate, and then have those ongoing lifelong learning skills. So again, despite that high knowledge, and 95% said they were aware of climate change and issues created for urban planning, that didn't necessarily follow through to their perceived skills to implement that knowledge. We found that the ability to have climate change competency was influenced by the number of years that the survey respondents had been working, and also being environmental planners. in terms of their specialisation, and also for one aspect for the land use planners. So there were some significant influences that we found. In terms of climate change experience and skills, we found that the biggest area of experience was in policy and regulatory development. And I've highlighted in yellow where the Canadian results had a higher number of participants, or proportionally for that result. And so we can see there are some differences found between the Australian and Canadian results. In terms of the impacts that the planners had currently been experiencing in Australia, high temperatures, drought and severe storms were the big impacts that they felt. And you could see that in 10 years, for all of them, they predicted that those impacts would get worse. And interesting, again, there were differences between the Canadian results and the Australian. And I see I've got 1 minute left, so I'll hurry up. And in terms of the information sources, again, Australian in our sample drew a lot from research, and particularly from universities and state and local governments. We have less leadership at the federal government level because they, for 10 years we had a Liberal government that wasn't taking much action on climate change. So we can see this reflected in the information sources they draw upon. And the main tools they used were local planning policies. We then asked them about we provided them some text about the need to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change, and asked them to reflect on what skills and knowledge planners needed to achieve those reductions in emissions. And these are the key things they said they needed, and we've sort of coded those against those Bologna knowledge, skills and competence. And we can see the ability to communicate came up as a most frequently mentioned response. In terms of learning goals for continuing climate change education, one of the main ones that came up when we coded them was about dealing with explicit climate change issues, and sometimes it was specifically mitigation or adaptation or vulnerability or hazard risks that they mentioned, and then how to implement that in their practice. So here are some quotes. I'll just pull out one here. So in terms of communication, they said, one respondent said, we need to be politically savvy and capable of providing a good narrative to capture the attention of the ignorant majority. Planners should not just be technocrats that talk about boring details. So that real ability to be change agents and get action happening. So in conclusion, there's strong awareness of climate change, but there were limitations about their ability to understand and apply that knowledge and make judgments. So we need to move beyond knowledge to develop competence in the students that we're teaching and existing planners. And there are a wide range of tools used to plan for climate change, but limited federal policies and guides were used by the surveyed planners. So it shows that lack of tools at that level that could be further developed. And we think that there's significant changes in the way that planning's conducted and viewed is needed. So planners need to develop those communication skills to empower them to be better involved in acting and getting action happening. So I think it also shows the importance of continuing education, and we can work with PEA to help develop some meaningful further education. So yeah, and again, more explicit coverage of climate change in the education of planners and the curriculum content would be beneficial. So I'll leave it there and I'll stop sharing.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for observing the time. I have the feeling that I have rushed you so much. Yeah, but that was a very concise way of wrapping up. Thank you. So I will move to our other speaker, Cassidy Johnson from UCL, right? Cassidy, can you share your screen?
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this session. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Zeynep, and other colleagues who we've had a few sessions together, sort of presenting some of this information. So it's very interesting to see how things have been progressing. And to have the chance to present to this audience. What I'm going to talk about today is a work that we've been doing with a number of colleagues, trying from ISOCARP. So this is, we have a thematic group of ISOCARP, which is called Resilience and Risk Mitigation Strategies. And this group has been led for a number of years by Richard Sleuzas, and he's just stepped down, and Daniel has taken over from the Technical University of Munich. And what we did is organize this it's a very small study. It was funded by my university, UCL Public, or I think they were sort of collaboration funds for topics around, bringing together different international researchers to work on topics. So I think we had a very small amount of money to do this piece of research, but essentially we were sort of interested in looking at what was happening across ISOCARP schools. And what we decided to do was draw on the Young Academics Network of ISOCARP. So trying to study how climate change is being integrated into planning schools across Europe is not really an easy thing to do. We realized because the context of the way credits are organized, what even is planning, where are they located within universities? It's all very, very different across the different countries, plus the different languages of all of the materials that we need to review, et cetera, et cetera. So it was much more complex than I expected to do this study, but I was very pleased that we had the help of these young academics. So we had a number of them involved that looked across what was happening in the different schools. And basically what we were able to do was look at sort of online resources, what is being published online about the different programs. But before I get into the results of that, I will just say that I think that we don't need to go into too much detail about why it's important to consider planning in terms of our climate change, in terms of planning. As we know, planning is shaping cities, and particularly we need, I think we all agree, those of us who are here, that planners need this sort of sound education about the implications of climate change, how cities can be developed to better adapt to climate change and to mitigate for climate change. And what we need to do is train the new generation of planners to be able to do that. And very bad timing, sorry, my phone. And what I think, we've reviewed some of the work that has come out, and I think there's actually very few studies that have been able to do this across different countries. And two of the people are here, Mark and Anna, presenting. But there's a number of studies that came out about 10 or 15 years ago that looked particularly at Western context and was suggesting that climate change had yet to permeate into education. And those studies kind of looked at issues around, should climate change be a standalone topic? Should it be mainstreamed? What is the role of accreditation boards? And as Anna's presented, I think, what are the relevant subject areas? And we also reviewed, there's a number of studies that have been coming from the Global South, also looking at planning curricula. There's a study, for example, by Schultz et al. That has reviewed schools across Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. There's a study across India, another in Southern Africa. That last one by Nala et al. 2022 is in fact a study I'm part of, which is not looking at climate change in planning, but it's rather looking at how disaster resilience is integrated into different kinds of teaching programs across India, not just planning, but different ones. So there is a lot of kind of related studies, or a few emerging related studies. But I think to summarize some of these papers on the Global South, what we see is big issues around the lack of competencies of teaching staff. And this is something I've seen really working with my partners across India, which is that, you know, they want to be integrating these topics into their teaching, but they have limited resources to provide training to the teachers. So a lot of the things are around how do we train the teachers about these topics so that they can integrate it into their planning programs. And then, of course, I think that, you know, there's this, the colonial vestiges and influences of the European and US schools of planning is still huge across a lot of schools, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in East Asia. And I think that this means that planners, and where this comes to be in climate change, is that planners are very ill-equipped to deal with, you know, the issues around, for example, you know, density is meant to be a kind of a good thing in climate change, which it does a lot of positive things, but there's sort of people are not being taught properly about sort of what are the different benefits of the kinds of density that you would see in a city like Dhaka, for example, which is incredibly dense in its informal environments in Bangladesh. So I'm trying to move here. Okay. And I think also, I mean, Anna's presented some analysis, and it's very interesting to hear that she's starting to try to integrate some of these things into, you know, the planning programs in Australia. And I think there are interesting, like UN Habitat has this very nice modules where they've developed curriculum. So there are certain kinds of resources that are available on how to build sort of curriculums. Particularly UN Habitats is very interesting for cities in the Global South, but also was taken up in a study on the UK that was done in 2020 that looked at, you know, what are the different topics of climate change being integrated. We, as part of this research, we organized this Urban Thinkers Campus as with the Planners for Climate Action. And in what we did with that, and it was kind of part of our methodology, but we presented sort of the findings of the research. Well, I'll present in a moment. They're not very long, so I don't need that long to present them. It's a very small study. But basically what we did was we tried to organize different geographies to discuss what are some of the issues around climate change, integrating climate change into planning schools across. We had one in Africa, we had one in Latin America, we had a European one, we had an American, North American, we had an Asian one, etc. So I think, you know, some of these issues I've covered already, but I think that one of them is this sort of connection between the real world issues of climate change, so that, you know, climate change works very, very well, I think, within these sort of within studios and within when you can kind of work particularly on the ground, and that a lot of the people who took part in that felt that those kind of were very good places to integrate climate change. So in our study, we particularly looked at this very basic question, which is how prevalent is climate change in planning programs across European countries? To what extent are European planning schools that are part of ASOP teaching about climate change and climate action? So we use the schools that are listed on the ASOP members directory website. And we tried to look at all of those schools that are listed there, including Turkey. And we managed to survey across a total of 28 countries and different schools in each country. Some countries have like several schools. So for example, in the UK, I think we surveyed 9 schools, whereas in some countries there was only one school that we could survey because of the number of members that are listed. And as I said, this was done by the young young members of ASOP. So what we did is we had a number of keywords that we looked for. So we developed this methodology with Mark Seasons and Elizabeth Hammond, who will present next. And so we tried to sort of emulate what they were doing in the US and Canada. So we had a number of keywords that we looked at, and we looked at different materials that were available on the internet about planning programs and what they were teaching. So for example, we might have looked at their reading lists and things like that, and information that was available on the web only. We collected this data 2 years ago, and some of the young academics were familiar with the country and some weren't. I think this made a difference sort of in the quality of what they were able to collect. But we basically, missing one of my slides there. Basically what we did is create this database where we input all of the different programs, and we were able to put how many credits per program, what are the different courses that are being taught, what are the titles of the courses. So we searched like the title, whether those search terms would be listed in the title or the any of the other materials that were on the web. So what we did was that we looked at 527 courses across 161 programs. We found that 9 of those didn't actually have anything on climate change. So we've taken those out and we've actually just looked at the ones that were mentioning climate change somewhat. So we had 413 courses across 143 programs. This is the slide I was looking for. And so we looked at, we don't have detailed syllabus here. So as I said, we're just using the online things. And we tried to group them into those that were core and elective, because we thought that was quite important, of course, to be able to look at that. And it's some programs don't have planning in the title, so we had to decide which ones to include, etc. So what we found is that overall, the amount of total credits, the amount that students are being taught about climate change in the courses amounted to an average of 1.46%. So a very low amount actually is being taught about climate change, as per what we can see on these on the online information. Out of the 143 programs that were surveyed, 91 programs have climate change in the core content of the program. And 83 of those programs have 2 or more courses on climate change. And what we found is that there are both, there's sort of a lot of them, half of them have in core courses and half have in elective courses. So a lot of what's being taught in climate change across European schools is still in elective courses. And I think this is a really key finding, is that we're not seeing a lot in the core courses, at least of the information that's available online, of course. We looked at how many courses had climate change in the title. We saw that 39 courses had climate change in the title, and this is distributed across 30 of the programs. So climate change was not something that was very typical in the title, even though it may be part of the course. And the core courses, out of the core courses, only 10 core courses had climate change in the title. And then we found that we looked at undergraduate versus graduate. We found that there's slightly more credits per program on graduate courses versus undergraduate courses. So climate change is a bit more prevalent in graduate courses than undergraduate courses. And then we were interested to kind of check the efficacy of our findings using a syllabus versus a non-syllabus. So some courses do have syllabus that are available online. So we found the courses that have syllabus, 31.4% were devoted to climate change, and those with no syllabus, we were averaging 32.1%. So we found even when we had the syllabus, we weren't finding like a great difference in the amount that was devoted to climate change. So if a program had planning in the title, 33% of its content were devoted to climate change. So there's, for example, courses, master's courses that are about planning and climate change. So those seem to have a very high content, obviously, of climate that were related directly to climate change, and of course a lot of other things. But here we also looked at the programs that had planning in the title. So not all programs are called planning programs. They may be in the School of Architecture, they may be in different schools, and this is quite difficult across European schools because they're set up very differently in different countries. So we found actually not a huge difference between the two ones that had either planning or not planning in the title of it. So it didn't really matter whether they said planning or not planning about how much content. So just to summarize some of the things here, I think that as far as we understand, this is the first large-scale and systematic study aimed at understanding the extent to which planning schools are even though it's a very small scale study, but it's the first one that's tried to understand across European schools. I think one thing we have done with this, even a very small study, is that we're building awareness of, in the EU planning schools about the urgency of mainstreaming this in the curricula. Partly we had the young academics involved. We've presented this to the ASOP, the heads of planning schools. We're almost 100%, almost like 98% finished our paper, which will be submitted this month. We were just a bit delayed over the summer. And we're cautious because we're using online data, so this is a sort of varied reliability. Also, not all of the data was done by people who are familiar with that country context, and I really think that we could do a much better and bigger study on this across European schools that would be able to be backed up with more information about particular schools, interviews and syllabus, et cetera, and looking at the kind of content of what they're teaching. So I present these results with some trepidation, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Overall, as I presented, I think the proportion of climate change being taught based on what we found is shockingly low. And the content does vary from country to country. We found, I think, we did a kind of analysis by country, which we don't really want to present because I don't think it's, robust enough to present it, by country, but some countries had up to 6%, whereas some had, close to 0%. So, it does vary. But I think one thing is that there's probably more being taught than is in the documents because, people are integrating this into their teaching. If I think about my department, people are integrating this into their teaching all the time. They just don't necessarily talk about it and in those documents. And I think, but we do say that this is a real missed opportunity to include these things in the documents because it's important that students know that this is a key part of the program. People don't always update those things. One of my colleagues doing the study has said, even ASOP on their website, we're doing all of this study, but it's not featured, for example, in the curriculum. The paper from, is from 1995 that's looking at what are the different curriculums that planners should look at. So for example, these things aren't updated. So, everyone is sort of, problematic in kind of doing those things. We're doing a bit more work on the accreditation boards because these work so differently in different countries. But generally this work by Andrea Frank, who's been looking at the different accreditation boards, she says that, only a few really actually explicitly mention climate change, but this is a really big issue. Although the people from our, the online session that we did, from the different countries, they said, really, we can't wait for the accreditation boards, though, we have to take action. The accreditation is just a very slow kind of thing. Yeah. So I'll leave that there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Cassidy. It's a very comprehensive presentation again, and it shows a lot of parallels with Anna's findings. So there's a lot of things to learn actually from both studies. Now I'd like to leave the floor to Mark, just trying to work against time. Okay, the floor is yours, Mark.
Well, thanks very much, colleagues, and I'm really enjoying the conversation so far. So many challenges, but also a lot of opportunities, of course, and similarities, especially with the Australian situation for Canada, and to some extent the US. It really depends on the province you're in Canada and also the state you're in the US. There's such variability in terms of understanding or receptiveness to the climate change issue to start off with and how it's addressed. So that adds a certain level of complexity as well, which would be similar to the ESOP experience, trying to understand what's happening across the European context. So it's called North American Approaches to Climate Change Pedagogy. It's work we did in 2020 and updated this past year. We're going to be launching in the Canadian context, applying for a large grant to revisit this material to the federal government's Natural Resources Canada. And by the way, I should say, Anna, that the federal government is fairly interventionist here. We have a Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, as well as Natural Resources. So they're all under pressure to show results, and they're active. Okay, I want to just move this along if I can. Okay, there we go. So I want to start off again, as Anna has done, with a land acknowledgement. This is important for us in Canada and the US and Australia as well. We acknowledge at the University of Waterloo that we are on the traditional land of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Hurlimann Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on either side of the Grand River. And this is in southwestern Ontario. We're located about 130 kilometers southwest of Toronto, actually. And so this, again, is something that represents our perspective on acknowledging the traditional rights of our Indigenous peoples across the country, particularly in this area. So the presentation reflects the work of our research team. My colleagues Elizabeth Infield, who's with the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Dr. Ward Lyles with the University of Kansas, and myself at the University of Waterloo. And we enjoy working together, I must say. So, and the work we've done has been discussed with my colleagues in other formats, as Cassidy pointed out. So, but the background of this is it's the first study of who's teaching what and how in Canadian and American planning programs. It's clear to all of us over the past few years we have to do something and make sure we're teaching and building capacity, but teaching the right kind of material in the right way and to ensure that it's retained and applied as our students enter the practice world. So it was really a first stage exploratory piece of research, I think, is research, as was the case with, I think, to some extent, Cassidy's work. We wanted to see, with a low budget, what is going on, generally speaking, in our planning programs in both countries. American study, but there's also a binational survey of chairs and directors of planning programs, just to find out how they perceive the whole thing and whether they're acting on it or not. I'll come to that in a second. So first, with research questions, what do climate pedagogy experts feel should be taught as foundation knowledge that will set the stage for the kinds of evaluations we would carry out in our respective projects? Do planning programs in Canada and the US deliver that content? And how is that curriculum delivered? What kinds of learning environments are we using for that? And as Anna and Cassidy had mentioned, we read the same kinds of material as background preparation for this work, from the UN Habitat, from the American Planning Association, the Canadian Institute of Planners, and you know, key and influential textbooks that have been done, including Barbara Norman's work in 2022, and of course an extensive range of peer-reviewed articles. And we found that from the literature, pretty much what you would expect my colleagues on the panel to know about, and they do. UK planning programs report a high integrates the climate change and core curricula. That's something that we think is going on, Cassidy. Perhaps you can confirm or refute that. The Australian experience is quite variable, as Anna has pointed out. In parts of the global south, the focus tends to be more on disaster reduction and adaptation, and then the global north focus more on mitigation adaptation. But the ideal in the literature is that where we can, we want to mainstream integrate climate change content as cross-cutting themes in everything we do in planning. And that addresses some of the comments made by my colleagues so far in the presentation. You have to have some good understanding, a good basic understanding of climate science as a foundation for the strategy we use, adaptation, mitigation. And ideally, we want a full challenge of the climate crisis and how we deal with it from an interdisciplinary perspective. Okay, just a second. So we had the Canadian study, and in that study, we looked at the climate-related content in planning and allied fields in university calendars. So we searched for keywords like climate change, urban climate change, climate crisis, et cetera, through university calendars across the country. Primarily in the 19 universities in this country that have accredited planning programs, and then we branched out from there to see what was happening across those campuses in civil engineering or in architecture or in landscape architecture and allied fields like that. And which was by Elizabeth Infield, they searched for a similar approach, looked at web pages as we did, and tried to get to specific curricula in university calendars, and they had an N of 92. And they, by the way, found that was a real challenge to find that information, because there is real variability in the kind of information provided by these universities about their programs and their courses. So I think this is a common problem across the system. And then Ward Lyles did a binational study of American and Canadian department chairs in planning and their perspectives on what's being taught and why. So, and how is it being done? So in terms of findings, clearly there's widespread acceptance of the reality and impacts of climate change in most parts of Canada and the US. It really depends on where you are. The provinces and states that produce oil and natural gas are clearly still in transition in their political understanding and acceptance of the challenges presented by climate change. But the rest are, of course, deeply concerned, and that's part of the challenge in a federated state like ours in the US as well. Lots of variation in climate change curricula and source of information. But an interesting finding, we found that geographers were really advanced in terms of their education that they offer around climate change. And so that if you have a good geography department on your campus, you'll find both the physical and the human geographers are actually on this. They're dealing with it. So that was a big help. And that means that we need to get that somehow, and that somehow is, if we can't provide it in planning, where is it provided across campus that they could access? We found that adaptation and mitigation subjects are commonly covered in the curricula, as is resilience and natural hazards, of course. But again, like my colleagues have mentioned, there are a few dedicated planning courses that focus explicitly on climate change. Now, I think that's changing. That's moving along, because now it's coming along. In fact, we have at my university a master's of climate change degree, not in planning, but lots of planners take that. So that's one thing that I think it's very helpful. And they do have a course in that program on community planning and climate change that I run. So these are the sorts of things that are starting to pop up, but we are getting more and more attention to it as universities update their curricula. And so it can be usually integrated in some planning courses, but treated as a cross-cutting theme in other courses. So it really is a matter of how much weight and attention does it get. In terms of the themes covered in courses, we're seeing that it's not simply around climate change, it's not simply the climate science or the strategies for solutions. It's also, we're seeing much more attention to not just sustainability writ large, but also social equity and environmental justice. And this is something that's certainly a high-profile issue across the profession, across the field of planning in Canada and elsewhere. And you can see it's really, as well it should, because after all, we must always think about for whom are we planning? I mean, who benefits and who loses as the impacts of climate change are experienced in our communities. So there is a lot of pressure to address climate change and to build capacity, and that's coming from students and also faculty. But as Ward Delisle's noted in his U.S. Binational study, in particular in the U.S., he's seeing such variability in receptiveness of state governments, of university administrations and faculties around climate change. Of course, as you know, the red and blue states in the U.S. so polarized in general, and it shows up again in whether faculty feel comfortable teaching this material and how it's taught. That's not the case in Canada, but it certainly is the case in parts of the US, and it's really tragic, I think. So generally speaking, there's also a struggle between the breadth and depth of content. How deeply do you go in the science versus the solutions versus the emotional issues around climate change, the climate anxiety and social justice and so forth? Can you do it all? And this is a real challenge for smaller programs, because in North America, most planning programs have got maybe 6 to 8 faculty. They're small, and so they don't have the capacity to deliver the whole thing, which means we have to therefore build constituencies and collaborations with other disciplines and departments to deliver the content. So that's when it is delivered, projects and workshop formats. Of course, this shouldn't be a surprise. That's what we do typically in planning anyway, but it does come across that way in the climate change content too. So lots of learning by doing and problem solving, experiential learning, working with real world clients, community associations, advising local governments and so forth. There's a recommendation in our work, which is going to be in a paper shortly, about the need to have a push from the accrediting bodies. I think this is something that Anna mentioned earlier. The Planning Accreditation Board in the US and the Professional Standards Board in Canada, they are aware of it. Well, in fact, ACSP has really promoted this with the PAB, and they're making changes. I understand that those are underway. And the same is coming in Canada. There's the profession is insisting it's not a good look to not.
Mark, I think we stopped listening to you.
Clearly, we're up on that. Oh.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah,
really?
I think your connection was breaking a bit, just to let you know.
Oh.
Yeah.
How's it now?
Perfect.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Where did we lose me? Okay. And again, smaller planning programs.
Yeah.
What's that?
We lost only the last few sentences.
They were brilliant. Insights, of course.
Okay.
And small, so just so you can read the text, and smaller programs have trouble delivering the breadth of content. So we have to move beyond this reasonably solid base about climate change science, which may or may not be provided by planning departments or planning programs. Address and acknowledge equity and justice aspects, as we do with everything else in planning education these days. Whether we go with dedicated courses or as cross-cutting theme, that depends on capacity in the programs themselves, and welcoming interdisciplinary approaches. So we are interested in what's happening in the allied professions in particular, and fields, and why not? It's important to have as much cross-fertilization as possible. It's not just a planning issue that only planners can address, as pointed out in the plenary session this morning. Of course not. So I think to get things done, explore opportunities to pool and share learning resources among universities and across campus, especially for smaller programs. Acknowledge and meet the demand for professional training in the planning profession through continuous professional learning, short courses, credit courses, and so forth. And put more attention on what's happening in both the global north, but also the south. And noticing as well the importance of context in terms of what we teach and how it's taught. Now, I'm turning to something that was touched upon by Anne in particular, clearly in Canada, and depending on where you are in the US as well, deep commitments to decolonization, that is to say, moving away from the traditions from the British and French regimes in this country to something far more indigenous based. And so that includes climate change content. And where we can, incorporate perspectives of indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge to complement, and I think test as well, to challenge the typical approaches, scientific approaches of research that we do. But think critically about what we're teaching. And the point being made here, basic science is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So don't stop at the basic science. You have to look at the nuances and the way in which and the art and craft of planning, and how we can work this into our communications skills and our land use planning and design skills and everything. So here are some of the recommendations from our work that will be in a paper that's forthcoming. All planning programs need core and required courses on climate change. Full stop. This has got to be a full commitment. This has to be demonstrated, we think. Ensure that program accreditation criteria include and require climate change content. Increase opportunities for cross-programming national exchanges of information and courses, especially as universities find themselves under financial constraints more and more often. We have to be smarter about this and not siloed about what we're doing. Extend content beyond technically oriented courses to address equity challenges, and programs and faculty must be supported to teach and research around climate change. That's much easier said than of education, some parts of the US in particular. So this is the last slide, colleagues. We have a paper in review right now that we think we hope will be accepted soon, called Teaching Climate Change Planning, Fostering Hope While Building Capacity. I quite that. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention. And as I said, very much enjoying this exchange of ideas and perspectives on the whole issue. We're very hopeful on our side. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your very comprehensive and insightful sharing of your research. I think there are some important points that come out from all these three studies. First, it seems like there is not enough coverage of climate change in spite of the importance of the issue, but it may be changing over time, but at the moment, it is very little compared to the groundness of the situation, perhaps. And it is very interesting in Anna's presentation to look at both the education and the practice side, and where is the gap actually, and how we can fill in that gap in terms of capacity to deal with climate change. And I think planners as agents of change that you mentioned is a very, very important message that we have to take anyhow, and how we do that, how we do fulfill actually that role of being agents of change in terms of climate change is a very important issue for both education and practice. I think as educators, we also need to define the role of planners in such a proactive way. Well, in all the studies, the issue of equity and so justice, climate justice, has been coming out, which is also very important. I mean, it is. I like this comment of moving beyond the technical issues of planning and embracing all these political issues. Actually, is something that is really very important, that needs to be acknowledged, and which also came up very strongly in the planning, education, and practice sessions we had last year, which means that we need to also politicize planning, to take sides in terms of justice and equity issues and so on, not only in climate, regarding climate change in general, but since we're talking about climate change, this is very important to see that. And The four recommend, there are more points, but I don't want to elaborate more so that we can give the floor to our audience. The four requirements, the recommendations that Mark summarized are also very, very informative. One of the things that I also would like to emphasize coming out of these studies is the role of accreditation. I mean, it can be really used as an incentive to increase climate content in education, given that there is awareness in those terms. Well, there's a lot more to talk about, and it's very, very insightful three presentations, I think. Now I'd like to leave the floor to our audience. I'm not seeing Ulrich. I think he had to leave. He wanted to comment, I guess. But anyway, then the floor is yours if you have any questions or comments to our speakers.
Well, I'm interested as well here in what my fellow panelists are thinking about these presentations, whether you're seeing similarities and differences, and how, to what extent. I think there are commonalities across the board. But I would start with Anna, who's on her last legs here. I'm sure at this point in the night. So talk now if you're going to talk.
Yeah.
You have a complete collapse. No, but seriously, what interested in how people are sizing up these presentations and what we're talking about.
I mean, there is some commonality, isn't there? Particularly when we've got direct comparison between, the questions asked in the Australian study and the Canadian Institute of Planners. But I guess it shows, as you mentioned, Mark, the influence of the political climate in the country. We've now had a change of government and there's more action at the federal level. But that short-term 3-year cycle of, election cycle in Australia does influence policy and strategy, and therefore what planners do. And I guess in parallel, some of the research I'm doing in Australia at the moment is looking at barriers and facilitators of climate change action across different sectors of the built environment, and that politics comes up as a key barrier. Lack of political will for change. So I think it's all really interrelated, and probably some of the differences we're seeing is the different political climate in different countries or states, depending on the time of the survey. Yeah, so that's hugely important. To get policymakers and politicians on board, emphasising the need for that political nous that you just emphasised again, Zeynep. So yes, it's complex.
Yeah.
I think it's very much related to the sort of political and social context. I thought that was interesting, Mark. I mean, obviously the US is so varied across the states, and sort of how and very divided, so I think there's probably really big changes in that, and I think what we see probably in across, and also you would see the same thing across European countries. I mean, obviously European countries or towards a lot of them are looking more probably at climate change issues and the social perspectives and things like that, but not all of them. Yeah.
No, these are good points. I mean, just for the viewers of the session.
I think Dorsa wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for providing us with this amazing opportunity to further know about this recent topic. So I'm a recent graduate of economics, and I'm living in a country where they pay a little attention to this topics, and as a student, so I think climate change is a complex issue that requires kind of interdisciplinary solutions. So I do agree that universities provide an environment that encourages collaboration and research. And as a student, I would love to further be able to extend my command of climate action. And because I've seen it, like a lot of professors at our university also help me a lot. So they they can lead us by example, by implementing sustainable practices and incorporating climate action education into their operations and infrastructure, so they can reduce their own footprints and help us a lot as students to better be able to help world in these fields. So thank you so much for your great ideas. I just wanted to thank you all for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dorsa.
Thanks, Dorsa.
Paulo Silva would like to take the floor. Yes, Paulo.
Yeah, I would like to intervene. First of all, to thank for the great presentations here on such an important topic. And I was wondering, because my university participated in the European research, and first of all, it was very good to be part of it. That's a feedback, because that makes us aware, and the feeling reflects the findings of your research, is that the topic of climate change is much more embedded implicitly on the way we teach our courses than explicitly. And I think this is because, of course, we as individuals, as academics, we are exposed in so many fora to climate change, planners for climate action, Habitat UN Habitat, etc. That almost in a natural way is embedded into our syllabus, but it's not explicit. I wonder if from the research you did in the different projects, if you could give some recommendations, because it seems that there's a will of embedding, of talking about climate change in a bottom-up way, let's say from the individuals, from teachers in their classrooms, but there's not like guidelines from departments, from faculties, from directorates of universities, of taking these seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And reforming our programs and reforming our syllabus of our courses and changing them, because these needs to be addressed. There's not a political assumption of it. I would like to hear you about this. Thank you again.
Yeah, Paulo, look, we recently, some colleagues and I got another grant from our faculty to do exactly that. So we thought there's huge groundswell Dorsa from our students, particularly after we had a really bad bushfire season in 2019, 2020 before COVID. The university made some commitments to climate change. Our faculty had established, we established a climate change action group. And so we said, please, we applied for a teaching and learning initiative grant to develop a framework that we tested on the Master of Urban Planning program to then, further roll out to other programs and faculties. So I think if we have that initiative, the universities are trying to support us. But interestingly, I wanted to pick up on the point of implicit versus explicit. So we looked, Cassidy, like you found, we did our content analysis of what was available, and our colleagues in the process of, this process of upgrading our curriculum across all subjects, our colleagues said, no, we're doing so much on climate change, but then we got all the detailed content and there wasn't as much as they thought there was. So I think it's really important that we think more explicitly about it, because if we're not being explicit, if it's not incorporated into assessments, then they're not getting that deep learning experience. So I think we do need to challenge ourselves too, to think what more can we do, and is it enough just to do things implicitly? And I'm not advocating that every subject needs to include climate change, but we need to look across the curriculum of a program and make sure we've got the right mix. So I am hopeful, but I am worried that it's going to come too late, all these changes, but it's better to try now rather than leave it for another decade. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
Might I say something at this point, Zeynep?
Yes, please. Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Thanks very much. Just to put things into context, like Australia, we've had a terrible couple of years with forest fires that are immense in this country, and floods as well, and all kinds of dreadful impacts of attributed ultimately to climate change. And so that has heightened political awareness of the need to not only do things, but be seen to be active and intervening, because the cost to property and health and lives is so extensive, and it's been extensively covered. So we get this, I think, in this country. At our university, just an example, we have I'm in the faculty of environment, so it's not a hard sell to deal with things like climate change across the departments. But on the campus, we have over 150 scholars working as part of the Waterloo Climate Institute on various aspects of climate change, engineering, arts, health. They're all involved in some aspect, from the psychological to the civil engineering parts. You know, all these sorts of things are going on. That's our culture here. It's not everywhere, but it is becoming more and more apparent across our country that they have to be seen and do things about this at the university level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now I'm being warned actually by our technical people that we have to wrap up in 5 minutes, and without forgetting to have a group picture, so you can open your cameras. But before that, Patricia wanted to say a few words. I'll give the floor to her, and then we can wrap up and take the session picture actually. Yes.
Thank you. It was more of a discussion than a comment, but so I don't know if the program where I teach, which is in the Department for Continuing Education at Oxford University, we teach sustainable urban development. So that might or might not have been picked up by the European study. In our program, 1/8 of our teaching is allocated to climate change. And we have a number of, this is a part-time master's, and we have a number of professionals that come to us with this feeling of knowledge gap. And they come to us as full-time practitioners to this master's in part-time to try and get sort of the solutions. Now, the complexity of the problem and how site-specific many of these problems and solutions are, I think sometimes what happens is students feel slightly disappointed because we don't have straight answers to give to them. It's not like, this is it, here is the recipe, follow it and you'll be fine. So even though we try extremely hard to teach them how to learn, which is what we consider to be the most adequate way to teach practitioners, grown-ups. So it's a postgraduate program for executives. But I think there's this challenge here for us educators to try and bring into the lecture room people who have enough technical knowledge to make it relevant to our students, but at the same time acknowledging how such a fast-paced, changing field, technical field this is to a certain extent. Of course, it's also very political. I don't want to, by any means, take that off the equation by any chance. But yeah, so it was more this reflection on the challenges of the topic itself, and if that might help to explain why we have still not enough in our planning degrees programs of climate change.
Yeah.
I realize we don't have much time to continue this conversation, but tomorrow and the day after, I'll be sharing this urban cafe sessions where we have just informal conversations about all these topics that interests us.
Actually, that would be great. We can continue there. And plus, we are going to have a second session on planning, education, and practice in terms of climate action on October 12th. And some of you who will be there, this conversation, I'm sure will continue face to face and lead to more substantial outlooks, I hope. I won't be there, but I'm sure that, you know, people who are there would be contributing a lot to the conversation. Now, may I ask your cameras to be turned on so that before people started leaving, they all leave, we can have a group photo. Yes.
Great, smile, please. One more. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for contributing. I wish we had more time to, it was just heating up. But as I said, there will be opportunity to continue in the World Cafe, and also in the in-person session. And thank you very much for your contributions. It was a very insightful session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Zeynep.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Cassidy.
Thank you.
Anna, thank you so much, everyone.
That's okay. I'll go to bed now.
Thank you all.
Without waking up anybody.
Good night and goodbye.
night.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.